Pluralism is recognized by most progressives as necessary for a more harmonious social order. The principle of making room for difference is most frequently applied in the realms of culture and religion, two categories which overlap closely. This approach is often grounded in the assumption of cultural relativism, the idea that there is no one inherently superior culture and that all are just as valid as each other. When made absolute, this principle is problematic. It tends to express itself in the terms of liberalism, presuming that equality of abstract socio-political citizenship and rights is equivalent to a leveling of all contradictions. Along with this, identifying and critiquing aspects of a culture, a practice which distinguishes that culture from the undifferentiated mass that is the leveling, is taken to be of necessity a reactionary damnation of a culture group as a whole. Euro-Americans in particular approach progressivism on the basis of liberal diversity, and base their positions toward oppressed people on the grounds of white guilt. Absolute relativism and a rejection of critique cannot be tenable for progressives, and especially not for revolutionary socialists. To rebirth the existing world into a new society, we must be willing to take sides. It is necessary to truly understand and take positions with regards to all societies, and the global capitalist society which unites them, not to simply ignore contradictions within them for the sake of diversity. To worship cultural relativism, to take all cultures as eternal, unchanging essences, is to excuse reactionary tendencies of societies and erase progressive tendencies. This is not merely a rhetorical question. There is a long history of reactionary ruling classes in any given society defending exploitative and destructive aspects of their societies on the basis of it just being their nature. In his book, The Culture Struggle, Michael Parenti makes this evident. What lawyers call the cultural defense, often employed in instances of spousal abuse and female sexual mutilation, is used in United States courts by all sorts of scoundrels. In 2001, Lucky Reddy Bali Reddy, an entrepreneur in Berkeley, California, who presided over a $50 million real estate empire, was found guilty of smuggling teenage girls into the United States from his native India. He used them for domestic servitude and sex, forcing them to live in conditions akin to slavery. One of them accidentally died from carbon monoxide poisoning while confined in one of his apartments. During the trial, Reddy pleaded the cultural defense. Keeping indentured servants in India is a common practice, he argued. Actually, it is a violation of both American and Indian law, and, in any case, Reddy had been living in the United States for some 40 years. Just how long, if at all, can one claim immunity from the standards of one's adopted country? If any tradition was involved in the Reddy case, it was the long-standing venal practice of the wealthy dominating the poor. In this instance, purchasing young girls from impoverished lower caste families with cash and the promise of a better life, and then using them for sex and servitude. Though those of us who critique reactionary strains of cultures are condemned as chauvinistic, it is in fact the cultural relativist equivocation of one part of a culture with the whole that naturalizes exploitation and incorrectly stamps the entire society with that guilt. This casts anyone within a particular culture as simply hardwired toward misogyny, racism, homophobia, and class antagonism. As Parenti points out, no culture is internally undifferentiated. In truth, the antagonistic currents of exploiting and exploited classes, and tendencies within them, are evident in all cultures. This practice is also well historied in the United States. For generations, slaveholders in the American antebellum South insisted that others respect their region's way of life, something the abolitionists were never inclined to do. By fighting for the emancipation of slaves, were the abolitionists guilty of ethnocentrism and cultural imperialism? Certainly they have been portrayed in some history books as a pushy extremist lot, yet opposition to servitude existed in various parts of the nation, including the South itself. Among some whites, and certainly among the slaves, as evidenced by their numerous attempts at sabotage, flight, and rebellion. Though many who are blinded by Americanist ideology might claim Euro-Americans were simply more backwards back then, based on the assumption that people become more enlightened as time goes on, In fact, the antebellum South's culture was not undifferentiated. The slave owners, slaves, and abolitionists clearly did not have the same values or desires. It wasn't that the founding fathers and other slave owners were of their time, it's that they were of their class. The slave rebels and revolutionaries, too, were of their class when they rose against the slave masters and their auxiliaries. Using the cultural relativism to fall back on naturalization of issues like misogynistic violence and slavery is nothing but ideological justification for the ruling classes. A common rationalization for continuing to stand by cultural relativism is that to accept the criticism of non-Western cultures is to open the floodgates for right-wingers to confirm their racist biases. Cultural relativists thus tend to say the opposite of whatever right-wingers say about these cultures, seeking to negate their bigoted points and thus stumble into a more progressive position. In reality, as mentioned, this extends the reactionary particular to cover the whole, turning cultures into unchanging blocks. As a result, we see self-identified progressives rejecting all criticism of non-Western societies and cultures. This comes with Eurocentric assumptions, often taken up by Euro-Americans, that if diasporas of a people in the West are oppressed, then their places of origin must also be defended on all fronts, as if the people there are in the same position as those diasporas. Progressives then dismissed criticisms of misogyny, racism, homophobia, and religious sectarianism in the Global South. Even people within oppressed groups take this idea on and form a siege mentality, sparring against all criticism of reactionary tendencies within their community on the basis of outside persecution. While this reaction is understandable, it is not an excuse. Though Euro-Americans do use reactionary tendencies within communities, such as those of Black people, to justify their oppression, to even cast themselves as the liberators, this does not mean internal issues are to be cast a blind eye. Rather, to address them on a consistently progressive basis is to do work toward a stronger community, one which is not divided against itself, which cannot be so easily co-opted, and which does not replicate the same internal antagonisms as those who oppress them. When we hide from issues in our communities under the blindfold of cultural relativism, we in fact alienate marginalized groups within and without those communities. For example, defending West Asian and North African countries, usually incorrectly referred to as Arab nations, against all criticism alienates, among many others, oppressed ethnic groups from within those regions. Assyrians, Copts, Mandeans, Yazidis, Black Africans, and Imajigan have all been oppressed by Arab nationalism. In particular, minoritized Christian communities like Assyrians and Copts are far too frequently dismissed by Western progressives, whose narrow Eurocentric worldview leads them to damn all Christians as oppressors and colonizers, whose cries of persecution are crocodile tears. This erasure has a very real and severe consequences. Many of these minorities in the Western diaspora gravitate to right-wing figures and their politicians, who actually bring attention to their persecution, however opportunistic their motives may be. Along with them, ex-Muslims' criticisms of their former communities do not fly with the diversity-mongering of Western progressives, who would take such attacks on conservative Islamic cultures from Swana as bigotry. An illustrious example of this shortcoming was how the Western left approached the fate of ISIS bride Shamima Begum. Socialists and liberals alike spent much more time discussing her issues with British citizenship rather than her voluntary participation in a reactionary, genocidal organization. This was to the point of Verso Books publishing an article about it wherein they fell back to criticisms of misogyny and Islamophobia. Instead of focusing on and helping the victims of the genocide like Assyrians and Yazidis, the Western left focused on humanizing a fascist enabler. In a similar case, a woman from the Netherlands, referred to as Laura H., traveled to Syria to join ISIS in 2015. She was arrested and charged for her involvement in terrorism when she returned in 2016, but she was released after serving 11 months of her 2-year sentence. In Dutch media and online discourse, she was depicted as a helpless victim of ISIS rather than an active participant in a fascist organization. Most visibly, a stage production titled Laura H. is being produced by Toneel Groep Oostpool, which has been condemned by the Free Yazidi Foundation for sanitizing the crimes of ISIS women. In their words, when Dutch citizens joined the Nazis, they did not have plays or glorification about them after World War II. Why are #Netherlands theater and media outlets giving a platform to someone convicted as an accomplice for the preparation of terrorist actions with #ISIS, #Daesh? Were progressives more consistent and radical and less excessively culturally relativistic? Their movements would make an effort to make space to incorporate Swana minorities and their needs. Right now, that is lacking. As a result, when these people look for a community that will stand up for them, Western reactionaries appear the most consistent. This is the consequence of excusing global reactionary tendencies and lazily ignoring progressive tendencies, rather than taking up the flag of a partisan of the latter in contradiction between them. When we recognize these contradictions between progressive and reactionary classes and their associated currents in all cultures, we drop the ignorance of liberalism and take a step toward a revolutionary position. The struggle against patriarchy, including misogyny and oppression of LGBT people, is an especially important component of this. It is often derided as something which isolates us and alienates people from us. In truth, waging this struggle against internal division on our front is how we build a stronger base, not leaving issues as they stand. Communist parties across the world, where they hold power, distinguish themselves with their dedication to the liberation of women. Though they of course hold flaws in their transitionary projects, the Soviet Union, People's Republic of China, the Republic of Cuba, and other countries made the entrance of women into public labor and their liberation from the control of patriarchs a priority in their programs. The Republic of Cuba is known for its contemporary, increasingly progressive stances on LGBT rights, with Castro rejecting his former reactionary positions, apologizing for them, and dedicating the power of the state to LGBT liberation. Also, the Communist Party of the Philippines defends and closely integrates people of LGBT communities in its ranks. Outside of communists, the masses of people in many contexts already have a history of resistance to patriarchy. In particular, many indigenous people in the Americas were persecuted by Iberian and Anglo colonizers for having non-patriarchal gender systems, including non-binary genders. Today, people such as the Two-Spirit among the Lakota in the Great Plains of the US, and the Mujes among the Zapotec in southern Mexico continue to resist colonial encroachment and thrive. Taking a progressive position does not isolate us. Instead, the key is to take a progressive position and tap into local, living histories of progressive tendencies. Included in this is making a strong stance against reactionaries wherever they may exist. This does not cede ground to Western right-wingers to be racist by criticizing patriarchy, racism, and class oppression outside of the West. Rather, diluting our positions through either cultural relativism or opportunistic appeals to reactionaries undermines us. It puts holes in our ability to stand apart from the rest of existing institutions and does nothing but reintegrate us into the system. If we want to accomplish our aim of revolutionary socialism, we must be honest and own our position. And we must do practical work to prove our honesty. We must be serving the people and hold no space for reactionary ideology. Absolute transformation is not carried out by the way of opportunism, but by way of consistency.